We ring this bell 3 times. The first is to acknowledge those who have gone before us, our biological ancestors, of whom mine came from Europe, and their ancestors from the Middle East, and theirs from Africa, as all of our ancestors have. Our intellectual ancestors, from those who first used fire to those who developed nuclear energy, both of which we are still struggling to control. Our predecessors on this land, the Muwekmi Ohlone, who lived in harmony with it for thousands, probably tens of thousands of years. The second is to connect with people of the present, those with whom we agree and those with whom we disagree, and those who are struggling to understand, which is all of us. The third is in hope for those who come after us, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, to the 10th, dare I say 100th, hopefully thousands of generations. Those who learn from us, our students, their students. Those who hear what we say or read what we write. Those whom we hope will nurture and restore the land after us.
I'll take everything off to do this. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I was born in October 1950, early in the Cold War. There has never been a day I did not live under the threat of nuclear weapons. In August 1949, the Soviet Union had exploded its first nuclear bomb in a dry riverbed in Central Asia. Oh, there it is, and there's its explosion. That's Joe 1. It was shown in replica. It was named after Joseph Stalin and was very similar to the fat boy that the United States dropped on Hiroshima August 6, 1945. In 1951, the Federal Civil Defense School drills known as Duck and Cover were implemented to prepare in case of a Soviet nuclear attack on America. I remember a couple of these drills. I found them partly fun, partly horrifying. Climbing around under our desks was amusing, but I could vividly imagine the glass blowing out of the windows in our classroom. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite. It sent out a 1-watt radio beep for 3 weeks until its battery died. But although only 23 inches in diameter, the spidery thing scared the adults in my life, so 6-year-old Donnie was naturally traumatized. I imagined it circling ominously around up there where no one could stop it. 5 years later, another autumn day, October 16, 1962, I was in 8th grade history class when our teacher, Mrs. West, announced that the United States and Communist Russia could go to war, nuclear war, over missiles being sent to Cuba. During the lunch hour that followed, I wandered around the schoolyard and looked at the sky to the west, dreading to see dark, dagger-like projectiles hurling towards us. As it so happened, the crisis ended after 13 tense days. Finally, a couple years later in high school, I had a dream that crystallized the meaning of nuclear Armageddon for me. An old pond a couple blocks from our home had been filled in with construction debris to make an industrial yard. In the dream, I was poking around its outskirts, noticing old bicycles, toasters, and baby carriages that were part of the fill, the detritus of civilization, waste and debris. Then I looked up and saw them, the daggers. I now knew that the force of the explosion, the excruciating heat, and acute radiation were all utterly deadly. I thought about doing duck and cover among the tons of broken concrete in the fill nearby, but stopped. Confronting hopelessness, I would die with dignity. I stood there and faced the onrush. Then, mercifully, I awoke. Can we all awake from this nightmare of nuclear weapons and war and hatred in general? Come, let us worship together.
Good morning, everyone. Those of you both here in Cole Hall and those of you online. Good to see you all this morning. Welcome to Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. My name is Gail Tupper, and I'm the secretary of our Board of Trustees. Our Unitarian Universalism is a radically inclusive, non-doctrinal, non-dogmatic, open-minded, and open-hearted faith. We are people who are all coming at truth from different paths. We gather across different identities, experiences, and beliefs to affirm and promote the inherent worth of every person. Together, we see our job is to love the hate out of this world, heal the hurt in ourselves and one another, and we'd like to be part of the change we want to see in this world. Remember, you can use chat either in Zoom or in our book. You can use chat, or you can use our book near the welcome table to share joys and concerns, brief notes of your personal milestones of importance that will be read aloud later in the service. If you're here for the first time, we extend a special welcome. We've been reaching out and asking people to bring their friends because we think the world, especially now, needs some friendly places to gather and find encouragement and hope. We have social hour after the service where we get to visit with one another in breakout rooms or here on the patio. Our worship host will give you more information about the Zoom breakout rooms right after the service. In the meantime, I will shortly put a link to our weekly newsletter in the Zoom chat so you can see upcoming events. We encourage you to join anything that speaks to you or ask us more about these events. We also put our welcome email, welcome@mpuuc.org, so you can request that we send a newsletter or other information. There are a few things we'd especially like to call your attention to. In-person attendees should be masked inside and outside of Cole Hall during the service. Since even vaccinated people can spread the disease to others, we strongly encourage those in contact with children and unvaccinated or immunocompromised adults to attend service outside or via Zoom. We allow worship leaders, associates, and other service participants to be unmasked while speaking if they voluntarily disclose they are vaccinated and are 10 feet apart from others who are not fully vaccinated. More information is on the bulletin board to your left and in This Week on the Peak. If you haven't already, please silence your electronic devices. If you hear or see something in this morning's service that inspires you or makes you laugh or brings you hope, please share it on your social media or tell a friend. We want to start a wave of love and justice with every gathering. Thank you all for joining us today.
Please join with me in reciting these words which call us together as a community and with Unitarian Universalists all across the globe. We light this chalice to remind ourselves to treat all people kindly, because we are all one family. To take good care of the earth, because it is our home. To live lives full of goodness and love, because that is how we will become the best people we can be. Oh, I forgot to light the chalice. I wonder what I was doing up here. You know, I like this one. I'll just light it directly.
This morning's service is about weapons and war. But there are better things to do than fighting or making war. Instead, we could play games. Here are two true stories of times when people who had been at war decided to play games instead. One is about a board game, chess. The other is about a ball game, cricket. The first story comes from the epic poem Shahnameh by Abul Qasim Ferdowsi. Over 1400 years ago, there was war between India and Persia. But the king of India had a better idea. He liked to play chess, and he knew the Persians did not know the game, so he sent a chess set to the king of Persia. With the chess set was a message. If the king of Persia could figure out the game, then India would pay tribute to Persia. But if not, then Persia would have to pay tribute to India. The king of Persia was perplexed and distressed. He sent for all the scholars in Persia and asked them to help him figure the game out. They were all perplexed and distressed. They studied the chess set for days. Finally, a young scholar who was not known for any brilliant ideas yet came forth with the answer. It was a game based on war, but you could play it without hurting anyone. Each chess piece was like some kind of warrior or castle or leader. They all moved in different ways, and even someone who wasn't very strong could play it. The king was so relieved he made the scholar his chief minister. The king of Persia sent the answer back, and the king of India was impressed. He paid the promised tribute, and the two rulers made peace. The second story comes from a film, Trobriand Cricket, an ingenious response to colonialism. It happened more recently, only a little more than 100 years ago, on the island of Trobriand in the Pacific Ocean, a little east of New Guinea. The island's villages were at war with each other. A Methodist missionary came to this island to preach a gospel of peace. Being from England, he also told them about the ball game called cricket. This is sort of like baseball. In fact, it was the source of the idea for baseball. It also gave the people of Trobriand an idea. They decided to accept the missionary's idea of peace and his game of cricket, and the villages began playing cricket games instead of fighting. Like Americans, who changed cricket into baseball, they changed the game as well. They incorporated some of their own traditional celebrations and dances into it. They changed some of the rules. They don't have a limit on the number of players on a team. Anyone from the same village, women and men, who wants to play can be on the village's team. Another change in the rules, one that a lot of baseball fans would like, is that the home team always wins. Yet another tradition. Instead of tailgate parties before a game, they have a grand picnic after the game, prepared by the people of the home team village as a treat for the people of the visiting team village. I wish we all could be as successful as that King of India and that Methodist missionary in getting people to play games instead of fighting.
I'm sorry, I rejoined you guys without putting my mask back on. Anyway, we take up a collection on Sundays for the simple reason that our purpose in gathering is for more than ourselves. We want to make sure that the ministries that we need, the ones that infuse worth and dignity into our children, our youth, and our programs of learning and leadership, and our ministries of anti-oppression, and our work in the larger world are in place to meet the needs of others. Anyway, sure. I have a hard time seeing that one. Well, to donate to Mission Peak UU congregation, mail a check to Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. It's P.O. Box 545, Fremont, California, 94537. If you use bill pay with your bank, you could use them to mail the check. You could drop an envelope with the check in Mission Peak UU mail slot addressed to Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. Envelopes are available at the welcome table or in the plate here, or pay online with credit or debit card. Note that we use PayPal for this and they charge us around 3%. We hope you will make a contribution towards these worthy causes by mailing your check to Mission Peak UU congregation at the address on the screen. You can, it seems like I'm saying the same thing. Anyway. Okay. You can also use the bill pay option in your online banking to drop your check in the Mission Peak mail slot, or pay online with a credit or debit card. Thank you for supporting and sustaining the efforts of our members, friends, and staff. Your contributions make loving, learning, and leadership more possible. One of the things that allows us to find hope and meaning, especially in the hard times, is the love and support we show one another. If you have a joy or concern that by sharing with this caring community might bring the encouragement or resilience you are needing, please write it briefly now in the chat. If you are here in person and would like to place a stone for a joy or concern, you may do so while the music plays and come up on your left, and here's our stone guard. If your need is personal, you can also send an email to our minister for a follow-up conversation. Oh, good one, Don.
Our music for reflection today is Simple Gifts, a traditional shaker tune arranged for bells and played on chimes by the Palm Hill Bell Ringers, founded by the First United Methodist Church and now also including members from Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. These are our various joys and concerns. We place one last stone for the joys, concerns, and sorrows left unvoiced. Thank you, Don. When I began working on my sermon for today, I let various friends know what my topic was. I found that several of them have had very deep involvements with the issue, and two of them are willing to share their reflections as part of this service. After my message, we will hear from Joanne Frisch about her participation in a group trip to Russia in support of the nuclear test ban treaty. Right now, we will hear reflections from our Minister Emeritus, Reverend Chris Schreiner.
Good morning. If I had to list the 10 most important issues facing humanity today, I would write 1. Preventing nuclear war. 2. Preventing nuclear war. And so on down to 10. Preventing nuclear war. Then I could start listing other issues. If that sounds like a wild exaggeration, think about all the anguish caused by 9/11 and all the ways 9/11 changed America, because 2 big buildings were destroyed and 3,000 people were killed. We cannot even imagine how it would affect us if even 2 or 3 of our cities were destroyed by atomic bombs and rendered permanently uninhabitable by radiation. We can't imagine it. The threat of nuclear war is too big to see. It's so overwhelming and so different from normal human experience that it's very hard to grasp this very real danger. It's kind of like not being able to imagine a pandemic till it happens. So we mostly ignore it, like we mostly ignored warnings from health officials that a pandemic would eventually occur. Our leaders apparently have no more vision and insight than the rest of us because they mostly ignore it too. Or they do things that make the dangers worse, as when a recent president canceled an agreement with Iran that had greatly slowed down their atomic program. Not surprisingly, Iran is now very close to building the bomb. We could be doing better at dealing with problems 1 through 10. When I was young, nuclear weapons were relatively new, and so they were in the news, much more than they are today. We had magazine covers with astonishing pictures of nuclear tests, hydrogen bomb tests, and we had duck and cover drills of the kind that Don mentioned earlier today. I also read fictionalized accounts of nuclear war in high school, and that made it more real to me. And in college, I saw the rather enigmatic French film Hiroshima Mon Amour, which showed scenes of devastation in Hiroshima that were burned into my brain. In theological school, I studied this issue and wrote a doctoral dissertation about ethical implications of nuclear weapons policy. One of my thesis advisors was an expert on nuclear war policy and nuclear war dangers from Claremont Graduate School. And it was a sort of a telling commentary that a few years later, this expert on the threat of nuclear war moved to New Zealand. After theological school, I was an activist for arms control and disarmament. At some point, I let my involvement fade away, and this is one of the biggest regrets of my life. Knowing what I knew, I should have kept at it. I'm sorry for my silence and inaction. I am relieved that these bombs haven't been used since World War II, but a lot of this is just luck, and luck is not a strategy. Eventually, they will be used unless we drastically reduce the stockpiles of nuclear bombs and missiles or completely eliminate them. Human fallibility, hostility, irrationality, and just plain incompetence guarantee an eventual disaster. Trying to prevent this disaster is a lot like trying to take practical steps to minimize the damage from the major earthquake we know will eventually occur. Dealing with this nuclear issue is a process, and it will take time. So Joanne and I make contributions to organizations that work for disarmament, and we put them in our wills. We need to lay groundwork for effective action by educating ourselves, building public awareness, and creating coalitions of government officials who make this a top priority. This should be a bipartisan effort. Hydrogen bombs don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And if we actually assembled a bipartisan coalition on this issue, that would foster much needed communication across the political aisle. I deeply appreciate this service, and Paul's reflection will give us an opportunity to think about the unthinkable, to catch a glimpse of something that's too big to see. We have an opportunity this morning to courageously face this peril, to make it more real for ourselves. Let's make it real in our minds and take real action so it will not really happen. And one way we cope with things that scare us is to use humor, sarcasm, and satire. We could begin with a charming little classical refrain.
For this morning's atomic history lesson, Joanne Schreiner and I, Newty Van Hoven, will delight you with an adorable Germanic waltz by beloved satirist Tom Lehrer, who introduced it with the question,
What is it that put America in the forefront of the nuclear nations? And what is it that made it possible to spend $20 billion of your 1960s era tax money to put 3 guys on the moon? Well, it was good old American know-how, that's what, as provided by good old Americans like Dr. Werner von Braun.
Gather around while I tell you of Werner von Braun, a man whose allegiance was ruled by expedience. Call him a Nazi, he won't even frown.
Nazi schmatzi,
Says Werner von Braun. Don't say that he's hypocritical. Say rather that he's apolitical.
Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down?
That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. Von Braun was a rocket scientist who began his career helping the Nazis design their long-range V-2 rockets that killed an estimated 9,000 people, not counting, of course, the missing or horribly injured, or the concentration camp laborers who died building it. Some have harsh words for this man of renown, but some think our attitude should be one of gratitude, like the widows and orphans of old London town, who owe their large pensions to Werner von Braun. After World War II, von Braun and about 1,600 other German scientists were quietly brought to America and given citizenship. In return, von Braun helped develop the intercontinental ballistic missile, as well as the technology that sent NASA astronauts to the moon. Despite this song, and reportedly being the inspiration for the title character in the movie Doctor Strangelove, in 1975, Werner von Braun was awarded the United States National Medal of Science. Really? Yeah? Okay. So, you too may be a big hero if you can learn to count backward to 0.
In German and English, I know how to count down.
And I'm learning Chinese now, says Werner von Braun. In German and English, I know how to count down. And I'm learning Chinese now, says Werner von Braun.
Thank you, Joanne and Nuti. Today is 77 years and a day since an American bomb obliterated much of the Japanese city of Hiroshima. No ordinary bomb, this was the first nuclear weapon. It killed over 100,000 people. It was followed in a few days by the second, obliterating much of Nagasaki and killing another 100,000 or more. I take this opportunity to discuss with you the causes and effects of nuclear weapons, why they are ultimate terror, and how perhaps we might move away from the prospect of destroying the entire Earth. I was born just a year and 3 months after Enola Gay dropped a little boy on Hiroshima, and I will use anecdotes from my life to thread a path through the complex issues involved. I grew up during the Cold War. Russia had also made nuclear bombs. Many suburban Americans dug bomb shelters in their yards. My family were renters in an urban core without that option, but we had shelter practice in school. My brothers and I played in nearby vacant lots and a schoolyard. As kids often do, we adjusted the rules of games, and I remember that in one tag-like game we called the penalty box Siberia. I also thought about how a game might be based on nuclear war. I came up with rules, but never asked anyone to play the game. My maternal grandfather was a chemical engineer and avid chess player, as well as amateur naturalist and amateur astronomer. An uncle was a mathematics professor, so we were all cognizant of current events in the intellectual world. I especially cherished these connections, which played a large role in leading me to science as a profession. But as children, what my brothers and I picked up was such tidbits as that Einstein was the smartest person alive. One of my brothers came up with the following syllogism: I am smarter than no one. No one is smarter than Einstein. Therefore, I am smarter than Einstein. In elementary school, I took up violin, playing in the school orchestra, and was pleased to learn it had been Einstein's instrument. Only later did I learn Einstein's deep connections both to development of nuclear weapons and to the efforts to control and ultimately eliminate them. I was in elementary school when Sputnik was launched, both galvanizing American scientific efforts and strengthening the Cold War mentality. The Cuban Missile Crisis played out early in my high school career, but some of the most serious events of that crisis only became known years later. It was well known that we had come close to nuclear war, but my recent reading shows we came much closer than just about anyone knew. I include this story not just as a warning, but also to honor a little-known world hero, Vasily Arkhipov. On Atlantic waters, the Soviet Union was transporting missiles to Cuba, missiles which could carry nuclear bombs. But there were also vessels beneath the surface. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had submarines armed with nuclear weapons. Among those, a Soviet sub dove to avoid detection. A few days later, it was unable to make radio contact. The captain concluded this meant that a nuclear war had already begun, and he decided to launch his. However, Soviet rules at the time required unanimous agreement of the 3 top officers of a vessel to fire. Another of the top 3 also voted to fire, but Arkhipov voted no. The world was saved for a short while. In high school, I added an interest in politics to my scientific devotion, and my family moved to the suburbs. But I chose to complete my diploma at my inner city school. Then I entered our local college and chose physics as my major. There I eagerly absorbed the various branches of physics, including special relativity and quantum mechanics. But I entered college sufficiently naive that when Werner von Braun was an invited speaker, I needed to ask why there were protesters. I began to learn the connections of science, not just to space travel and medical care, but also to war. I learned that Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, not only explained how nuclear power plants could generate electricity without burning anything, but also how a nuclear bomb could destroy much more than an ordinary bomb. I also learned that the popular account of genius Einstein having a super productive year in 1905, elucidating multiple mysteries, relativity of motion, the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, is a gross oversimplification. The principal elements of relativity theory had already been proposed. Einstein's contribution was to combine them into a logical theory. Most importantly, for the present topic, 2 years earlier, Ernest Rutherford had written, "If it were ever found possible to control at will the rate of disintegration of the radio elements, an enormous amount of energy could be obtained from a small quantity of matter." Nevertheless, at about the time England and France agreed that Hitler could have Czechoslovakia, it was Albert Einstein, generally considered the smartest person alive, who was presented with a dilemma. Several of his fellow smart people had come to him with a letter to be sent to the President of the United States, urging the U.S. to build an even more destructive weapon than any so far conceived. Einstein's pacifism would have said no. But Einstein, a Jew and a recent immigrant from Germany, had direct knowledge through his experiences and his connections with others still in Germany, both of how awful Hitler was, of how awful Hitler and the Nazis were, and of the state of German science and engineering capable of developing the use and misuse of nuclear energy. So the letter was signed and delivered. After some uncertainty, the secret Manhattan Project was launched. It was successful, depending, of course, on what one means by success. After the first test, the leader of the project, physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, recalled words from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But in the meantime, history had taken some of those strange turns for which it is famous. Japan had entered the war on Hitler's side, bombing Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States fully into the war. U.S. President Roosevelt had died, thrusting Harry Truman suddenly into the most critical decision-making position in the world. Then Nazi Germany was defeated, finalized by the suicide of Hitler. But the war with Japan continued, with only the prospect of hundreds of thousands more deaths before it concluded. Truman made the decision to approve the use of the nuclear bombs against Japan. He was advised that it would save lives, since many more would die in a U.S. invasion of Japan than would die from 1 or 2 nuclear bombs being dropped on cities. In fact, my senior year of college, I had a part-time job at which one of my coworkers said his life had been saved by the nuclear bombs. He was in the U.S. Armed Forces, trained to set up communications. He was to have been among the first to land and was expected not to survive. I have also read an analysis in a thick "What If" book I have, which indicates that Japanese lives were also saved, as more would have died in a U.S. assault. I find these analyses inadequate, though. They compare just 2 alternatives, without considering, for instance, a simple halt to hostilities. While it is true that Japan remained in aggressive military dictatorship, the Japanese empire had been dismembered. It no longer had the ability to launch attacks like Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, the analysis fails to consider the long-range results from introducing nuclear weaponry into international conflict. Einstein was upset at the use of the nuclear bombs against Japan. That was not why he wrote the letter, and there was no evidence Japan was at all close to developing a nuclear weapon. Einstein became a campaigner for international control over nuclear weapons to prevent them from being used again. But the dilemma was not just for Einstein. We still have a dilemma now. After World War II, the United States and Russia both developed their nuclear arsenals. President Eisenhower announced a new look to the U.S. military, emphasizing nuclear weapons as being economical. And Soviet leader Khrushchev announced the importance of the Strategic Rocket Corps. This led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from which we escaped just barely, as I have told. This in turn led to Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD, a theory under which nations with nuclear weapons would not use them because it would lead to world destruction. I will now tell you the rules to my nuclear war game. The players stare at each other. If they all remain silent, the game is a draw. If even one of them says bang, then everyone loses, including those who were not even playing the game. And that is the essence of MAD. Supposedly, no one will dare to say bang. But MAD does not protect from a suicide bomber, in the face of whom punitive justice is ineffective, and perhaps even counterproductive. We've already had one suicide bomber with a nuclear bomb, the captain of that Soviet submarine. How many more have there been, or are there? Perhaps Kim Jong-un, perhaps Donald Trump, perhaps Vladimir Putin. Restorative justice is also useless when nuclear weapons are available, unless the world waits 500 million years for life and civilization to evolve again. Ultimately, I conclude there are only two options: eliminate nuclear weapons or be annihilated. I prefer the former, but I also see no immediate way to accomplish it. Therefore, I turn to Einstein's proposal as a necessary intermediate step, namely international control over nuclear weapons. This also will not be accomplished quickly or easily, but the alternative is vaporization of some of us and death by radiation poisoning of the remainder. I believe our most immediate need is to keep maniacs from becoming the leaders of nuclear nations. No single action or process will accomplish this, but I believe we know some contributions toward the goal. First is democracy. Most of the significant nations now claim to be democratic, but there are serious reservations about the actual democracy of Russia and China, plus even the United States to a lesser degree. I think the United Nations could establish explicit standards of democracy and have a process for suspending the voting rights of nations not making adequate democratic progress. These standards should include not only the election, direct or indirect, of national leadership, but also limitation on their terms. Power corrupts. Both Russia and China recently amended their constitutions to allow their leaders to continue beyond previous term limits. And here in the United States, we recently saw an outgoing president nearly overthrow the democratic process to keep himself in office. The welfare of people, nations, and the world is much more important than the petty ambitions of such individuals, and also more important than the glory of individual nations. In addition to possible efforts of the United Nations, democratic nations and business enterprises need to be much more cautious about becoming economically entangled with, much less dependent on, non-democratic nations, especially those with nuclear weapons and the willingness to use them. We are currently experiencing the problems resulting from European dependence on Russian gas and USA dependence on Chinese computer chips. Misuse of military force or economic pressure are not the only threats to democracy and the election of responsible leadership. Mass falsehood seems to be a great growing threat. We need improved education and international news dissemination. Even here in the United States, honest education, including critical thinking, has not been fully achieved and is under strong threat from would-be dictators in governor offices. A significant number of wars have been started using falsehoods. The Second Gulf War was justified by the false claim that Saddam Hussein still had weapons of mass destruction and was seeking to purchase uranium. And the current Russian invasion of Ukraine was justified by the false claim that Nazis in the Ukrainian government were persecuting ethnic Russians. Millions and millions gullibly believed each of these. There will always be liars. What we need is for most people to be able to recognize and reject frauds and fantasies. We also have a still more immediate need. Vladimir Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons if he is unable to conquer Ukraine without them. Just a few days ago, the head of the United Nations alerted everyone that we are now closer to nuclear war than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So far, it seems, the United States and Europe have successfully followed a narrow path between abandoning the Ukrainian people and triggering nuclear war. If Putin wins, he will be emboldened to conquer more. Nations such as Israel, Iran, Pakistan, India, and Taiwan will remember that Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in 1994 in return for a guarantee of protection, and will conclude that safety lies only in the opposite direction, enhancing nuclear arsenals. If, on the other hand, the bravery of the Ukrainian people, with the economic and weaponry support of the free world, is able to resist Putin, we may have a brief reprieve during which to work for world democracy, honest education, and free news dissemination. I wish I could have brought a message with a more clear course of action and strong hope of success. We must not cease our efforts to affirm and promote our values, including the nonviolent resolution of disagreements and restraint from escalation when force is necessary. But all will be lost if a maniac at the helm of a major nation says, bang. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be part of your production this morning. This is my statement about eliminating nuclear weapons. In June 1994, Tri-Valley Cares, Citizens Against a Radioactive Environment, were invited to Russia to help conduct a seminar on the conversion of nuclear weapons laboratories to peaceful uses and to collect petitions on the CTB, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, to end atomic atmospheric nuclear tests. The petition was written by Mary Leah Kelly, Executive Director of CARES, and illustrated by my husband, Hans. I created flyers and a large canvas banner for the seminar that I hand-carried to Russia. The first slide, please. The seminar was co-sponsored and organized by CARES in Livermore and CCI, Center for Citizen Initiatives in San Francisco, and our counterparts in Russia. Members of other peace and environmental groups from San Francisco, Oakland, and New Mexico accompanied us. We flew into Moscow and were met by activists who would travel with us overnight on the Trans-Siberian Railway to our final destination in Nizhny Novgorod, a city of 3 million. It had been sealed because of nuclear submarine research and open to outsiders only after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Those attending the seminar were guests of Russians who opened their homes to us. We heard many stories of the hardships of the Russian people under the Soviet rule. Second slide, please. The 3-day seminar was conducted in a university. The banner I created was spread across one wall next to a larger-than-life bust of Lenin. We laughed at the irony. The seminar was a wonderful success, attended by many Russian activists, including a nuclear scientist from a laboratory like the Livermore lab. We were given thousands of our CTB petitions that had been translated into several languages and sent to activists all over Eastern Europe who had gone door to door to collect signatures. There were 6,000 signatures from Russia, with one petition signed by President Boris Yeltsin. Third slide, please. 3 months later, in September, I had the honor of delivering the CTB petitions to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. Activists from America, England, Russia, and France were escorted into the Secretary General's office for a private meeting. He was Russian, and I greeted him in Russian. Dobry den, a real high point for me. The CTB treaty was adopted in September 1996 by the UN General Assembly. It has not been entered into force by the 8 nuclear nations. Nevertheless, America and most of the other nuclear nations are abiding by the treaty. No further atomic tests have been done above ground at our Nevada test site. That brings me to the present. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, launched an effort to outlaw all nuclear weapons. The Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, needed 50 countries for entry into force. Honduras was the 50th, ratifying it in January 2017. As of March 2022, 86 nation states have signed the ban treaty. The U.S. has not signed yet, but nuclear weapons are now officially illegal internationally. ICAN received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. This shows the progression of finally getting rid of nuclear weapons. People working together can accomplish the impossible. Those countries who say no to abolish their nuclear weapons must realize that there is no limited nuclear war. We need to continue to work for complete abolishment for our children's sake. Thank you.
Please join with me in reciting these words to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Instead of a going deeper slide today, I would simply like to let you know that if you would like further information on the topic of nuclear weapons and efforts to control and eliminate them, you may contact Reverend Chris Schreiner or myself. Our contact information is available on the MPUUC website. If requested, I can in turn put you in contact with Joanne Frisch and the group in which she participates. Albert Einstein said, "May the spirit of trust and confidence, of generosity and brotherhood among men prevail. Otherwise, human civilization will be doomed." Please go in the spirit described by Einstein, the spirit of love. We hope to return in the spirit of peace.